First, I do want to go ahead and get started with discussing the G7 summit. For those of you who are not aware what that is, let's go ahead and dive into the explanation first, and then we'll discuss what's happening in Hiroshima. The G7 summit is an international forum held annually for the leaders of the G7 member states of, make this bigger for you, for the people who have to sit in the back. Member states of France, the US, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Canada in order of rotating presidency, as well as the EU. Now, some of the features that they'll usually discuss at the G7 summit, the leaders of the G7 would share fundamental values such as freedom, democracy, and human rights. This is really interesting. The democracy piece and the human rights piece in reference to the United States. That's interesting. Exchange candid views on important challenges the international community is facing at that time, such as the global economy, regional affairs, and various global issues, and issue a document as an outcome of such discussions. With the leadership of the leaders of the G7, which shares fundamental values, the G7 has effectively responded to important challenges that the international community will face. What was interesting there is that they did not mention war. And that's interesting because one of the top discussions at the G7 summit was this war with Russia and Ukraine. And I found it interesting that in the freedom and democracy that they laid out there in reference to their values, they didn't mention anything about warfare. So pay close attention to that. So we're going to start off with this clip here from Morning Joe, which discusses the opening day of the G7 summit, which of course includes the war in Ukraine. Let's get started.
Okay, so let's begin with the opening of the G7 summit wrapping up in Hiroshima, with the group of 7 leaders attending a working dinner together after a full slate of cultural events held earlier in the day. On Sunday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to join the summit in person to see commitments for more aid in his country's fight against Russia.
So that was just this past Sunday. We'll get into that as well.
Bring in NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli live in Hiroshima. Mike, what's the latest?
Well, Mika, obviously there's a very jam-packed agenda for the G7 leaders here after the first of 3 days for this G7 summit. They're talking about everything from the state of the global economy, how to combat inflation, dealing with supply chains, competition with China. But at the very top of this agenda has always been the continued battle in Ukraine and the ongoing efforts by the G7, other allies, to support Ukraine in that effort. There was a strong statement issued by the G7 leaders after their first working session today, pledging their continued support for Ukraine militarily, as well as through security and humanitarian.
Let's pause there for just a second. So he just told you that they're gathering and they all have agreed to continue to support Ukraine militarily. That's the first one. We'll get into the other issues. Now, I want to remind you right now, Joe Biden is trying to negotiate with Republicans in reference to the debt ceiling. Now, we can argue back and forth about whether the debt ceiling is actually real. MMT peeps will tell you that the debt ceiling doesn't even really exist. It's not really a real thing, so to speak, right? But right now, he's actually trying to negotiate and considering reducing spending in reference to the social programs just to get this debt ceiling budget passed. So he's willing to take away money from the social programs, but of course not from the defense budget. And this is something that we've been pretty vocal about before on the show. And now you hear that in reference to the G7 summit, that one of the top agenda items is to send more money to Ukraine for military aid. So you're arguing about the debt ceiling in this country, which you can't seem to figure out and negotiate with. You're willing to take money away from social programs instead of taking money away from the defense budget, because if they reduce that defense budget, then they have to try to justify if they have that money to send to Ukraine. And that's what this is really all about. So these two things are connected. And I've heard people talk about the debt ceiling as a separate thing and the G7 as a separate thing, but they're really connected issues here in reference to the United States government. Zelensky appearing at the G7 summit to ask for more money. When is enough enough? How much more money are these countries supposed to give him until the people in their countries are poor? We can't give everyone health care in this country, but we can try to find a way to continue to give more money to Ukraine. Let's go on. Just something I want you to think about. Let's go back a little bit because he was mentioning humanitarian pieces here.
As well as through security and humanitarian assistance. And the fact that we're now confirming that President Zelensky will attend this summit in person on Sunday just speaks to that continued focus. We've seen President Zelensky on something of a world tour. He, over the course of the past week, has visited the capitals of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Rome, even met with Pope Francis, and today setting foot in Saudi Arabia, attending that Arab summit there as an indication of his efforts to really continue to build support for Ukraine ahead of this spring offensive. As part of the sanctions that are being announced today, we're seeing a continued unified front among the G7, efforts to really target Russia where it hurts, both their continued efforts to finance the ongoing war, but also to get around some of the evasive tactics that Russia has been making for sanctions that were already in place. Now,
so these countries, their leaders have decided to get together and to continue to implement sanctions on Russia, as he said, where it hurts. But you have to keep in mind that those sanctions also hurt people in their countries as well, not just Russia. You have the UK, you have France. Macron can't even figure out what to do with people in his own country right now. That's why there's protests there. So they're willing to allow people in their own country to continue to struggle in order to support Zelensky until the last Ukrainian. Remember what they said at the WEF? We are willing to go until the last one is standing. Let's go on.
Now, Mika, we also know, of course, that the looming debt ceiling crisis back home has also been overshadowing this. And we saw President Biden, in fact, cut short his participation at the G7 leaders dinner this evening here so that he can get a fresh update from his team as they start their day back there at home Friday morning. White House tweet from an earlier update that the president got indicated that the president is continues to be confident that they'll avert a default. And in fact, conversations Kristen Welker and I have just been having with White House officials speak to that optimism as well. They're not ruling out, in fact, that the president might speak with Speaker McCarthy on Sunday just before he ends his participation in the G7 summit to head back home. So there is that continued optimism. You can understand why the president wants to project that optimism, because a default in the United States would not just devastate our own economy, but it would have ripple effects throughout the world. So it's a top concern.
Hold on to that piece that he just said right there. A default in our own economy would have ripple effects, with the debt ceiling would have ripple effects, not just with our own economy, but also throughout the world. In other words, they wouldn't be able to give money to Ukraine. That's what that really means when he says throughout the world. If they can't figure this out, they can't balance this, figure out this debt ceiling, how they want this to go. That means that if we have that default, then we're not going to be able to send billions of dollars to Ukraine. And that's what he means by throughout the world. That's what this is really about. Terrible, terrible stuff.
Of the other G7 leaders here as well.
All right, NBC's Mike Memoli reporting live from Hiroshima. Thank you very much for that report. Now, Mike.
Okay, so that was the opening day remarks, but for those who are not aware, there are also protests that are happening at the G7 summit. Now, these are people who came out to protest because they don't want a nuclear war. And they know what is being discussed at this G7 summit. They know the top priority is this war with Russia and Ukraine and giving Zelensky more money. Now, Wyatt Reed tweeted this out. He said, big protest condemns the imperialist G7 summit happening in Hiroshima. for Biden to bring the nuclear football to a city where the U.S. killed over 100,000 civilians with a nuclear bomb is a grave offense to the victims' memory. That's what the demonstrators are saying. So you have to remember, this is probably not the best location to have a discussion about funding war, considering what happened in Hiroshima. So you have to remember that. So obviously, some of the people there may be a little bit on the edge of their seats. They may be a little bit frazzled, a little bit afraid, because they have memories of what happened before when you want to talk about a nuclear war. Let's hear what some of the protesters had to say. And we'll show you another clip as well from Democracy Now! So here are some of the protesters. Yep. And there's more footage as well. It's like, they're not stupid here. They know what these talks are really about. And no, like, they don't want to be put in harm's way in reference to a nuclear war. I don't think anyone really does. Anyone who has, their right mind really does. But there was also a Hiroshima survivor that spoke to Democracy Now! And I think you need to hear what she had to say. This just brings back bad memories for people who lived through it, the people who were there during that time. But not only those people who were there during that time, even some of the younger people, they know this part of their history. So listen to this clip here from Democracy Now! I want you to hear what the Hiroshima survivor has to say in reference to the G7 summit.
The G7 summit wrapped up Sunday in Hiroshima, Japan. Much of the summit focused on two issues: the war in Ukraine and China. President Biden announced $375 million more in military aid for Ukraine. He also pledged to begin training.
She said that very quickly, so I just want to say that for you again. $375 million in aid for Ukraine. All this money just going out the door for another country. All this money going out the door. And we just kick people off of Medicaid.
Ukrainian forces on flying U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets. Biden did not offer to send any F-16s, but the U.S. has lifted its opposition to allies supplying the warplanes to Ukraine. Britain and the Netherlands have announced plans to work together to help provide Ukraine F-16s. President Biden spoke Sunday.
In my private meeting with President Zelensky after the G7 meeting and with his staff, I told him the United States, together with our allies and partners, is going to begin training Ukrainian pilots in fourth-generation fighter aircraft, including F-16s, to strengthen Ukraine's Air Force as part of a long-term commitment to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. I have a flat assurance from Zelensky that they will not use it to go on and move into Russian geographic territory.
And you believe that? He got a handshake from Zelensky and a nod that they are not going to proceed into Russian geographic territory. And you can just take him at his word. Okay.
But wherever Russian troops are within Ukraine and the area, they would be able to do that.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who attended the G7 in Hiroshima, thanked Biden for his support.
We are very thankful. I think he will give us more strong positions on the battlefield. So,
give him more strong positions on the battlefield. How are they getting strong positions on the battlefield? How? Is there anyone out there who really believes that they would be able to defeat Russia? Russia has an ally in China. Russia is a part of BRICS. Like, do they really believe this, guys? I never thought from the get-go that this is really about winning. I don't think this is about winning. I think this is just about profit. Julian Assange said this best when he said the goal is not to win. The goal is to have a forever war. So you can continue to funnel the money in. That's what this is really about. But do people honestly sitting at home, do they seriously believe that Ukraine stands a chance against Russia winning this war, no matter how many weapons that you send them?
Well, we're thankful that is a new package. I really didn't know the details, but I know that you gave us a very big package during this year. It's more than 37 billion.
He hasn't given us that package.
My appreciations. We never forget. Thank you.
While in Hiroshima, President Biden and other world leaders paid tribute to the victims of the world's first nuclear attack, the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, laying wreaths at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial and planting a tree. But President Biden did not issue an apology for the attack. A group of anti-nuclear activists rallied on the streets.
Japan and the United States are trying to conduct a war of aggression on China. I am protesting because I absolutely cannot accept the fact that they are in Hiroshima, a place where an atomic bomb was dropped, trying to hold a meeting to start a nuclear war.
Exactly. It's the optics, you know. And I like seeing the protesters out there because that tells me that more people are waking up. What did he just tell you? He said, we do not need to try to escalate any type of war with China. And I totally get that and totally understand. But the fact that they're out there and they're like, look, we know what this summit is really about. We know what's really happening here. That is a good sign that more people are starting to see this.
I'm absolutely against the war. I'm against using nuclear weapons. That is why I'm here. This summit is being held to prepare for a nuclear war, so we, the Union, need to do whatever we can to protest against it.
We go now to Hiroshima, where we're joined by Setsuko Thurlow, who survived the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima in 1945 that killed about 140,000 people.
If you think about it, that really wasn't that long ago. 1945.
She's devoted her life to nuclear disarmament and the ban treaty process. In 2017, she was chosen to accept the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. She's joining us on the phone from Hiroshima. It's great to have you back with us, Setsuko Thurlow. If you can respond to the G7 meeting and the outcome this weekend held in Hiroshima, where you are.
Well, I came to Hiroshima from Canada, where I live. I wanted to be part of this whole excitement that the world leaders are coming to Hiroshima and to discuss the nuclear disarmament. And the people here are so excited, so happy to have the opportunity to give them to give the leaders the opportunity to be with us, to be in the center of the calamity and catastrophe, and to have a profound encounter themselves with the meaning of the dawn of the nuclear age. And people had a great anticipation and excitement. They prepared for this with all kinds of recommendations to the leaders, but somehow their wishes were not fully listened.
So she said that people there gave recommendations to the leaders who were present at the G7 summit, but their recommendations were not well received, so to speak. They weren't listened to. So continue to listen to what she says.
To put it bluntly, for us survivors who want nothing less than the total disarmament, total abolition of nuclear weapons, and the majority of the citizens of Japan who support survivors' idea, to us, it was nothing but a disaster.
Yep.
We are feeling more than frustration. It's a fury, anger, and a total disappointment.
She said the caption here is incorrect. Instead of fully, it's fury and anger. And she says that it's a total disappointment. Could you imagine what it must feel like to be a survivor of Hiroshima? And to see them having this meeting about a possibility of even like pushing towards any type of nuclear war. Could you imagine what that feels like? I don't know how many survivors are still alive, but this has to be triggering in a way.
Setsuko Thurlow, how do you think the war can end? The war in Ukraine can end?
Well, to me personally, why we keep hearing about more military aid and support for war than hearing about the efforts being made for peaceful ceasefire at the
because there's no attempt to do that. She said, why are we hearing about more aid, more military aid for war, to continue the war, instead of hearing about peace talks and a ceasefire? Because that would defeat the purpose of the profit for the war. There's no profit in peace. That doesn't help the military industrial complex to call for a ceasefire. Doesn't help them at all. There's no money to be made there. That's why you're not hearing about a call for peace. By the time the US government comes around and calls for some type of peace, it's usually years later and after the countries are already devastated. Now they want to come forward and they want to have a call for peace with a country like Syria and say, okay, maybe we should stop doing this. Now they want to come forward and they want to say, okay, yeah, maybe we should call for like a ceasefire in Yemen after so many people have been killed in Yemen. The people are starving. The kids don't have food to eat. We've seen the video footage. Now they want to come forward and call for the peace after they have already devastated and demolished the countries. That's when the US government will come forward and call for peace. After there's nothing left in those countries for the people to go back to. After the people will be poisoned because of the chemicals that have been released into the air from the weapons that are being used. That place will not be safely habitable for those people. And you can't tell me the people living that are still alive in Yemen right now, you can't tell me maybe they're breathing now, but you can't tell me 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later from now, they may not end up with some type of illness just from breathing the air. They'll come forward and ask for peace after they have stripped every single thing they can from you and there is nothing left. Then they'll talk about peace.
Earliest possible time, every day, and many lives are being killed. And certainly something must be going on. Some quietly, some effort must be being paid for ceasefire. But we don't hear about them. Are they really making that effort? Do they?
No, they're not making that effort. I'll answer her question for her. No, they're not making that effort at all.
Really feel they can win this out? I don't know what's their thoughts. All I can say is it has to stop at the earliest possible chance, no matter what.
And finally, President Biden did not apologize for the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And then,
Excuse me, I didn't hear you. What did you
President
say?
Biden did
Excuse me, I
not.
didn't hear you.
President Biden did not apologize for the U.S. dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
Of course he didn't.
And 3 days later on Nagasaki. Your thoughts?
Well, it's unfortunate. He had the opportunity, but he didn't. This time, too, in the joint statement or communique, it kept criticizing the Russians, the Chinese, the North Korea. And why do they fail to look at themselves with the critical eyes? And we don't hear anything evil which is being committed by the West. I mean, of course, as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, I think that Putin should get a total condemnation. I do condemn, no matter what the reason is, to be willing to kill so many human lives. And that's not acceptable. And that must stop.
But Russia was calling for peace negotiations earlier on.
Your question was whether the president should have, well, my opinion is yes. United States had committed the crime against humanity.
The United States has committed crime against humanity. So in reference to the U.S. government making apologies, they're not really known for that. I don't remember them apologizing to Haiti, Somalia, Syria, Yemen. Like they're not really known for that. But one thing that she said that I thought was interesting is she said, it seems like you never hear about crimes of the West being committed. And she's right about that. Now, it's true. Unless you're watching like independent media, for the most part, if you're watching mainstream media, you won't hear about those things at all. You won't hear about the crimes that the West has done unless you study history. And I mean history outside of a standard textbook that's in K through 12 education, because they don't even go that deep into it to really get into the meat about the crimes that the West has committed against people in other countries. And no, it does seem like, for the most part, it seems like the enemy is always someone who is not a part of the West. And that is on purpose. So no, Joe Biden, he did not apologize. You come into the people's home, you come into their country, have the U.S. government doing what they did in reference to the nuclear bomb, no apology. And then you sit down and you meet with Zelensky and talking about, let's give him more money. Let's figure out how we can continue this war in a country where the people were pretty much almost wiped out because of the nuclear bomb. How can you be so tone deaf? It's the optics, people. It really is. We'll finish up her talk here.
The United States has never acknowledged any guilt. And well, this proves old saying, the victors write the history. The U.S. has been condemning
Setsuko,
Russia's behavior. But yeah.
Okay, and that's around about the end of it there. But I wanted you to see that because I wanted you guys to see that it's not just about this conference where everyone, all the different leaders from the West, they come together and they sit down and talk about democracy and freedom as it was defined in that first article that I showed you. The main topic of discussion for this particular event was this war with Russia and Ukraine and how they can come together and give Zelensky more money and continue this war. That's what this was about. So people need to see that. And the people there who are protesting, shout out to them because they really need to be getting that message across. Terrible, terrible. I'll take that comment on Rockfin, Eric. All right. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Dave. Check out the book 1984 on Forever War, published in 1949. Of course, some real dark visions of our future there, but others like Black Mirror and Michael Parenti and Richard Wolff have described what 21st century perpetual warfare looks like under Wall Street direction in league with their codes around the world. Well said. And thank you for this tip, Hemp Carr. Fallujah is worse than Hiroshima with their cancer and birth defect rates and prominent medical journal read. Chomsky said this is bigger news than WikiLeaks in a Z magazine interview. A doctor in a piece on Harvard's website said the killing of 250 500 probably of Iraqi scientists is a sure way to not get testing on depleted uranium. Thank you so much for that, Himkar. I'll have to check out that article there.